Okay.
He'll sit here eventually. He said he'd like to go there.
Oh, that would be fantastic.
So I'm thinking maybe, you want to be there by 5:30, maybe like 4:45.
That sounds good.
We got Mexican, Chinese.
Okay, Mexican's always good with me, so. Okay.
Let's do that in there quick.
Okay, that sounds great. One of my favorite places I discovered by accident when I was doing a program in Oskaloosa one night. Hi.
Jim Smith.
Nice to meet you.
Dave.
Hi.
Nice to see you.
Thank you for having me.
Plan supper, 4:45 at Mexican. You know how high that is on the
That works for me. Hey, anyway, I was needing someplace to eat down in Oskaloosa. My Mexican restaurant sounds good. They have, we'll see if this beats it, they have the best Mexican restaurant in Oskaloosa I've ever been to. It is fantastic. So, yeah, so if you head that way on 92 at some point, it's right there on the highway, just where the mall is. It's right there at Penn Central Mall. And it's fantastic, in my opinion.
You could even run a restaurant.
I probably could at this point here. That's part of my problem. I need to stop eating out so much. I was down this last week in DePella because I went to Central, and so I always volunteer at least a day for Tulip Time. And when I was in college, I was a cross-country runner. I was 140 pounds. And anyway, I had a Dutch costume made for me, and the lady that made it still lives in Pella, and she still does seamstressing. And I've gotten to the point where, buttons on the side, because the Dutch have the flap on the front. Well, those buttons are over, they're supposed to be over here, and that thing gets narrower and narrower every year. And I was all held up with safety pins this year, and I called her and I said, okay, Susan, I got to appeal to you because I can't do this another year. I said, I got to have you alter this outfit. She goes, oh, we decided we don't have a 30-inch waist anymore. No, and I don't think it's probably going to ever happen again at this point. So I'm like, how much?
They make those pants in other sizes. So
Well,
it's meant to be.
It is. Well, that's actually, she said, she goes, that's a pretty easy thing. Because she's got the space in there. We just need to move the buttons and reconfigure things a little bit. So when I got done, I took it over there and said, we'll get it ready for next year.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning.
He does.
I could flick the lights, but I already turned them off. You didn't take the hint, Phil. I'm sorry.
I just follow your saying.
Somebody has to, right? I'm not good step to follow. Trust me. Thank you for coming this morning to our Hill of Beans. I will not be joining you. It's that lovely Tuesday of May, Husky Help Day. So you'll see high school kids. I apologize now if they come in and cause chaos. Becky, we'll keep Kate under wraps. I promise.
We'll just rope them into the show. We'll make them participate.
So welcome. Linda's going to do our introductions, but in June, it'll be June 9th, will be our next Hill of Beans. So that I had to stop there because the first is on a Monday. You what? Poor Farm, yes. Linda's going to do the Poor Farm, Madison County Poor Farm in June. On June 9th will be our next one at 9 o'clock here. We'll see you then. And I'm going to kick it over to Linda. Thank you all for coming. We're making more coffee. If you need more, it's in the back. We'll get you. We'll find you. We got stuff. Help yourself to donuts. Dawn, did you get your donut? Okay. Just remember, there's always one hidden in the back for me. Don't get it. You came early to get your donut. Good job. So thank you all for coming, and I hope you enjoy. Have a great day. Linda. I already started. It's going.
Okay. I'm just going to give you a real short introduction. This is Dave Baker. He has a Facebook blog a Facebook page that I follow called the 29th State. And did you know Iowa was the 29th state? So he's catchy like that. And I'm not going to give you a long introduction. I just saw Dave at Greco Price last year, and he did the ghost towns of Madison County. And I'm like, we got to get you here for a Hill of Beans. So that's why he's here, and he's going to take the rest of the intro and get us started.
Thank you so much, Linda. Well, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
How are we doing today on this very, very windy day? I needed to put a little bit more glue in my hair. I got in here and was standing straight up. Mercies. Well, I have made a very strange career, hobby thing, second career we'll call it, going around the state of Iowa and exploring our communities. And it's a lot of fun because I get to meet a lot of great people and I get to see a lot of really interesting things. And I get to be a part of a lot of different places. And so it's a lot of fun for me to go out and explore Iowa because there's so much to see. And sometimes people go, there's not that much to see. Well, I've been doing this a long time now, and I can tell you there's some really neat things. You just need to know where to look for it. And along the way, one of the things that I discovered is that there's a lot of former communities that really have interesting stories to share. Well, why do we care about talking about former communities? Why is that important to us? Well, I'm not going to answer that question just yet. We're going to answer that question later on this morning. But be thinking about how some of this might impact your daily life and how it might impact the communities that are still here today. Before I get too deep into this, just out of curiosity, other than Linda, has anybody else ever been to any of my programs? Okay, I got one over here. That's good. Was it the one in Earlham? Okay, very good. That was a fun program. It was a great crowd. So that's nice because you don't have a whole lot of expectations. But I hope when you leave here, you'll go, wow, and tell your friends and hopefully encourage people to come and attend future programs. So I do a lot of events around the state. This is a side hustle. It's an evenings and weekends and a lot of very early mornings for me, but it's all worth it. I've been doing Iowa history events since 2016. I've done, well over 100 at this point. I can't even keep track. And I've gone to all kinds of different places. So ghost towns are the topic, though, that people are the most interested in. And when you talk about ghost towns, you quickly discover that what qualifies as a ghost town is very, very subjective. And so we're going to talk about a lot of different places today, and some of them are going to be actual towns that were laid out in city streets and blocks and had businesses and post offices and things like that. And some of them that we're going to discuss are a little more than wide spots in the road. But even these places sometimes have a very interesting story to tell. So we're going to back up to 1905 right now. And this is the Madison County map from 1905. And so if you were to look at the whole county map, you're going to see a lot of things that are on there that are familiar to you. Even in 1905, you're going to see places, of course, like Winterset and Macksburg and Truro and St. Charles. But there's going to be other places on there as well that might just kind of look a little bit unexpected. So if we were to go out to the east side of town and we were to head towards Patterson, you would see a place on the 1905 map called Tileville. Well, what exactly is Tileville? Well, it was a community of sorts. It wasn't a platted town like Winterset is, but it was a place that people would have referred to, and it was a place that some people would have called home. Now, in 1911, so 6 years after this map was printed, I want you to think about what it would have been like to have been standing outside and see dark storm clouds approaching. In 1911, there's no National Weather Service. There's no real consistent forecast. There were some in the newspaper, but they were updated infrequently. And there was no way to communicate a potential weather disaster. And in 1911, there was a gentleman named Will Smith who lived at Tileville. And as he looked to the west, he noticed that there was a funnel cloud beginning to form. And when that funnel cloud began to form, he did the only thing that he knew what to do. He grabbed his wife and his baby, and he got them into their cellar just in time. Well, that tornado touched down just outside of Tileville, and it worked its way through the rural community. And more than a dozen buildings, farm and otherwise, were destroyed or badly damaged. Barns were not just knocked down, they were completely scattered. Pieces were thrown across fields. But the tornado, as we know well, tornadoes do weird things. Winterset unfortunately knows that, right? Well, some of the things when Mr. Smith came out that he saw really perplexed him. There were places, for example, that were completely flattened except for a piano left standing where it had been before. And there was a house that was nearby that was under construction. The house itself was blown down, but the boxes of shingles were still sitting right next to it, completely untouched. A little farther along, he saw a house that was completely reduced to ruins, but the trees were still standing by as if nothing had happened. Not even the leaves seemed to be missing. And so it was so perplexing to him, and it was so perplexing to the other people that lived in Tileville, that they wrote about it in the newspaper. And the Madison County newspaper here in Winterset, the Winterset Madisonian, covered this 1911 storm and talked about just how strange it was for these people. And even clear up until 1956, when they ran a reprint of the story, people still remembered seeing the debris and seeing what it looked like out there. And what's remarkable is, as it moved across the farmlands and moved across the fields in that 1911 tornado with no warning system, there were no deaths. There were only minor injuries. And it's pretty remarkable when you think about it. Storm seemed only to last a few minutes, but it changed the lives of the people that were there in the Tileville area. Now, if you look at it and you think of the buildings that were at Tileville, there weren't very many of them. And so losing 12 buildings in the area, that composed most of the town, if you can call it that, most of that community. And it's probably a good thing that Tileville wasn't more established, because if it was a more built-up community, there probably would have been more injuries, and there may have even, unfortunately, been some loss of life. But Tileville itself wasn't completely knocked out by the storm, and part of that's because nobody really knew exactly where Tileville began and where it ended. It was kind of a nebulous thing. There was the area, there was a Tileville farm, but what exactly the community was, that was pretty relative. Sometimes you see it described as a few miles over to the east, and sometimes you see it listed a little bit farther to the north. And really it's because that whole area, more or less, was Tileville. Now, again, it was not a platted town, it wasn't laid out, and so that makes it kind of difficult for us to understand what exactly it looked like. And so when we think about these communities that existed back in the 1800s and the early 1900s, we have to remember what they really were for. Communities existed so that people could share resources. And towns were convenient ways to do that. Not only could you share resources in the town itself, but if you were the landowner that owned the town site, you're going to make a little bit of money on the side, right, selling those lots. So it was important for us to have communities. It was important for us to have lots of communities every few miles. Not everybody could do every job. You had to have somebody who could maybe blacksmith. You had to have somebody who had connections to run a store. And it took more than just the farmers in the area to have those roles. Now, the area of Tileville has had people creating communities since really the beginning of the time the county was formed. And if you were to go just a little bit east of where Tileville was on that map, and if you were to go back about 70 years before that map, you would find a little place called Montpelier. Montpelier was actually the first post office that was established here in Madison County. Now, the post office itself eventually was moved into Winterset when it became the county seat. Well, then they decided we need a few more post offices over in the eastern part of the county, and so they reestablished it and called it Independence. At that area, there was a gentleman named A.D. Jones, and Mr. Jones ran a store. Again, you have to remember, getting stock in even a small country store was no easy task at the time. You had to get your merchandise here. Madison County, unlike Des Moines, unlike Oskaloosa, I do a lot of programs in Oskaloosa. Oskaloosa is not, fairly close to the Des Moines River. Ottumwa, of course, right on the Des Moines River. Very easy to get merchandise shipped up the Mississippi River into communities like that. Madison County was a little bit different story. You had to get stuff up the river, and then you had to transport it usually by either horse or oxen. And so Mr. Jones was very important in the area because he had those connections to get people things that they needed. Now, again, Alfred Jones, he was a very prominent politician in addition to being a storekeeper. And somebody once said about him that he was the smoothest person in politics. He was really good about getting his way. And so at one point in time, he wanted the county seat to be located over in the area where his property was, which would put the county seat roughly where Tileville was, just a little bit further to the east of there. Well, as you know, the county seats were designed so that everybody in the county could relatively get to the county seat within a day. And if you put the county seat clear over there, on that part of the county, up in the northeast side of things, that's going to be real unfair to the people down the southwest. Well, at the time, there weren't a whole lot of people down the southwest part of the county to argue with him. But he ended up losing out on that one. Even though his property did not become the county seat, he became the county surveyor, and he had a hand in laying out Winterset. Eventually, he moved on from Madison County and became the first mayor of Omaha, Nebraska. So he was very well connected, knew a lot of people. By the 1870s, the Tileville area was starting to get more and more people there. It was on a main trade route. People were beginning to move in and populate the townships more than they had pre-Civil War. And so the 1870s, they called the area that became Tileville the Narrows. And they discovered that there was a lot of really good clay in that area. And of course, anytime you have clay, you have the opportunity to use that to your advantage. And if you can get a kiln built, you can have a clay works. And there were hundreds of clay works all across Iowa because there's a lot of good clay, especially along the rivers, that allowed them to produce bricks. And so if you look out here, for example, at the Bevington House, or any of the bricks in downtown Winterset, or any of the bricks in Des Moines, most of those, if they were made before 1900, were sourced locally. Now, I can't say for a fact that all of them came from Tileville. A lot of times they'd mix them even together. So you might have Des Moines bricks and Winterset bricks and Oskaloosa bricks and whatever else. But that clay was, once you got the kiln built, all you had to do was go out and get the mud. So it was a fairly low stakes investment once you got the initial equipment set up. And so the Tileville farm was a brick and tile work that was at that community site. And as you can see here, even into the 1920s, the operations there at Tileville continued to be expansive. And so they would actually ship brick from the community up to places like Des Moines, and they would use it up there. 1906, this is the Rock Island timetable. If you come to my program tonight at the Winterset Library, we're going to talk more about the railroads and what exactly this meant. But the Rock Island provided rail service through Tileville, and so it provided freight. They were able to load up those bricks and ship them. Because obviously the one downside to bricks is if you're relying on horse and ox, you can't ship a whole lot of bricks. They're very heavy, right? Trains can pull that load. And so that allowed there to be some economic development at Tileville. Of course, if you go there today and you look at the area, well, it's right here. You don't see a whole lot going on there, right? There's farms in the area, there's some houses in the area, but there's no real sense of a town or a community, so to speak. And that's what we find happens with a lot of our ghost towns. They're not necessarily well defined to begin with, and once people begin to scatter, you sort of lose that cohesion. You sort of lose what it was that kept them together, especially as people move towards the bigger and more established towns like Winterset, St. Charles. Okay. So those of you who were at Earlham last year, if you think way back, you might think we always have this discussion a little bit. This is kind of a key piece of all the programs I do. How do we define a ghost town? What exactly is a ghost town? What does a ghost town look like? What are some answers to that?
Empty buildings.
Empty buildings, absolutely. What do those empty buildings look like?
Run down.
Run down. I always think even after doing this for 15 years now, I always think ghost town, and my first thing that I think of is an old gold rush town in California, Nevada, right? It's got those big wooden buildings with the big tall, front of them where they would have had a sign painted on there, kind of like the law office out here, maybe, that sort of look about it. That's what I think of a ghost town. But there's all kinds of different ghost towns. And here in Iowa, many of them look like a cornfield or look like a soybean field. Why? Well, we like our economic development, right? A field that has an empty building on it isn't doing us anything. If we knock that building down, we plant it, and now we've got some crop. It's going to bring in some money, right? That's one way to look at it. The other thing is unlike the deserts of California and the mountains of Arizona, we're in Iowa. We have weather here. And sometimes that weather is very wild. We have blizzards, we have tornadoes, we have derechos, we have heavy rain, we have no rain. Well, guess what that does to wooden buildings? They don't last very long. So it's a matter of opinion more than anything what exactly a ghost town is. And some people will say you need to have absolutely no people living there. And some people say, yeah, if you have 5, 10, 15, 20 people there, it's still kind of a ghost town, especially if it's much bigger. So we're going to look at a couple different examples. First one we're going to land on here is Barney. Barney is not, by most definitions, a ghost town, unless you're being a little bit sardonic, right? Some people drive through and they go, yeah, this is definitely a ghost town, and run down and mumble about it a little bit. Call it a ghost town either in jest or kind of as a pejorative, right? And it certainly has the hallmarks of a ghost town, or at least a town that is maybe slowly turning into a ghost town, right? Barney, as it is believed, is the only community here in Iowa that I know of to be named after a mule. And it was named so because the mule Barney was one of the railroad mules, and the railroad relied on mules to lay down the train tracks. They needed human labor, but even with human labor, they had to have some animal labor with that as well. So Barney the mule was on the site of the community, and he was helping lay things out, and he died. They honored him that way, and the name stuck. So he was known for being reliable. He was known for being tough, and that kind of fit the town of Barney too, right? So it was laid out by the Chicago Great Western Town Lot Company. Town lot companies, they came in, they bought land off farmers, and they laid out the towns and did all the legwork behind the scenes. They hired the surveyors, they did all the legal stuff. They were really an important section of the railroad. And so the railroad itself formed the southern boundary of the town. There was a public square originally in the plans. How many of you have been to Barney? Yeah, can you imagine there being a public square there in town? They planned it. And then by 1888, 1890, Barney was a big shipping point. There was a lot of trade that went in and out of there. There were 2 hog buyers. They shipped pork all the way to Chicago, and they shipped pork all the way to St. Joseph. And so they did a lot of livestock transactions through the town of Barney. There were 6 passenger trains that went through there daily. And so people could travel to Des Moines from Barney, and they could make a day out of it very easily. And they didn't have to do a whole lot of extra work. They could just go right in town there, hop on the train, and they would eventually get into Des Moines. And so it became a very key local point despite its relatively small size. Now I went back and did some digging on Barney. Anybody here from Lorimer? Well, okay. Lorimer they did a great centennial book back in 1987. They did a great feature on Barney in there, and they told lots of information about the town. So even though that's a Union County, not Madison, we're going to lump it in here. It's all good. So what businesses did Barney have? Well, they had 3 general stores. One of them doubled as a post office. They had a lumber yard. They had 2 hotels in town, just in case you wanted to go spend your honeymoon down at Barney, right? They had a creamery. They had 2 blacksmiths. They had a doctor's office. They even had a professional photography studio in Barney. There was a schoolhouse, and there was a Christian church that was founded in 1902. It closed in 1973. And in 1905, there were enough people there that even though it wasn't incorporated, they recorded what the population was, and it was 70. So 70 is not very big, but if you think about some of our smaller communities here in Iowa, I don't know, how big is East Peru? Probably not much more than 70, right? And they had a lot more business there at the time. So the records definitely support that there were at least 70 residents. If you count the farm people around there, it's probably even more than that. And Barney still has a population, albeit a small one. So again, do we call it a ghost town? Well, I don't know. Most of the streets are gone. There were a lot of streets that were laid out. Most of them have since been delisted and returned back to the county. So I would say you could put Barney in there with the ghost towns. We could count it there. But if we contrast that with Gear, anybody know where Gear Post Office is? Okay, well, we're going to talk about that. I don't know who put the sign out there, but I was really glad they did because a lot of our places like this aren't actually marked. Well, Gear, no abandoned homes, no abandoned businesses left. It's just mainly fields, and again, somebody who was nice enough to put a sign out there. From what we can tell, unlike Barney, there are no remaining streets at all in what would have been known as Gear. If we want to know what kind of place Gear was, we have to do a little bit more homework. We have to do some legwork, and that's where I come in. So how do we investigate a ghost town, aka homework? Well, I spend a lot of time at the State Historical Library. Spend a lot of my lunch hours there because, again, I have a professional job. This is the side hustle. So spend a lot of lunch hours not eating lunch down at the State Historical Society digging stuff up. And so when I go in to investigate a place, I do a lot of research ahead of time. There are 938 official communities in Iowa. When I started this, there were 947, so we've lost a few of them. They're still there. They're just now unincorporated. In Iowa, if you're incorporated, you're a city, and if not, you're an unincorporated place. Not all unincorporated places are ghost towns. In fact, many unincorporated places are doing quite well. Looking at you, Boonville. I typically break things up by county when I work on it too, which makes it really nice to keep it organized. So looking at Madison County, investigating Gear, here's what I find out. So David C. Mott wrote a book on ghost towns in 1932. So we had ghost towns all the way back in 1932. Now, most of the ghost towns that are in there are still ghost towns today, as you might expect. There's just a few of them missing since then. Well, Gear is listed in there. And so when I looked at what was there about Gear, he said it was in Monroe Township. It was in section 13. Okay, well, I can go look that up in my map. So look up a map, Monroe Township, there it is, Gear Post Office. If you look right down here, you'll see number 6. That's Monroe number 6. It was a one-room schoolhouse. Schoolhouses were roughly every 2 miles. So we had a schoolhouse and a post office there in close proximity. This is from the let's see here. I've got it listed as 1901, but actually this is, I mislabeled that. This is actually the 1875 A.T. Andreas Atlas, which is really the gold standard when you're looking at ghost towns. This one's in 1901, excuse me, I apologize for that. Again, you can see the post office and the school on there. So if you're looking at maps from before 1875 here in Iowa, you're going to get mixed results. Map makers did not really exist in Iowa before the 1870s, before the railroads came. And so any map maker that came here had to travel by horse, and by the time they got back home, a lot of times the maps were already incorrect because things popped up, disappeared that fast. Andreas, he made the map in 1875. By that time, he was able to come by railroad. He was also based out of Chicago, so he didn't have so far to travel. So we get a lot of good information from that 1875 map and then also the 1901 map. And Gear shows up on both of them. And we don't see a whole lot of buildings there, but there's a lot of homes in the area. We've got the Bishop home, the Bowman home, the Austin home. And these homes would have all been associated with that post office. They would have recognized this as a community. And so if we do some literature reading here in Madison County, we can find out a little bit about some of them. And William Bowman, for example, he's got the property where the post office is here. Well, it turns out he was a fairly well-known farmer. Well, he would have been well-known. He was the postmaster. Everybody knew him, right? And so when you dig into that and you start investigating just exactly who he was, he suddenly becomes not just a name on a page. He was somebody who was a living, sentient, breathing human being. And so, just a little bit here from Find a Grave. He's buried up at the Winterset Cemetery. If you dig into a little bit of his story as postmaster, he was incredibly well-liked. His neighbors really thought the world of him. And so, when the post office was going to be renewed, everybody wanted to make sure that he kept that post office because he was easy to get along with. Not all postmasters were like that. Postmasters were political appointments. And so if you happen to be a Republican and your postmaster was a Democrat, well, he might be sticking your mail underneath things and hoping you don't notice it until your creditors showed up. Yes, that really happened. Not with Bowman, though. Bowman was well-liked. Who's seen this book here, The Herman Muller, Madison County and Its People? Fantastic book. I bet you've got a few copies of it lurking around here, and I know you have them over at the library. Gear is in that as well. And it says the post office Gear was named in honor of Governor John H. Gear. He was an Iowa governor. And it was established 1879 at the home of John Reesner, and then later at the home of William N. Bowman in Monroe Township. It was on the route from Winterset to Murray. Later mail was brought in from Barney. It was discontinued September 12, 1903. When you look at these rural post offices, a great many of them are discontinued in 1901, 1902, 1903. Anybody have any idea why?
World War I.
No, before World War I. That's a good guess, though. Rural free delivery. Rural free delivery killed a lot of these off here. So, when you dig into the Bowman family, all of a sudden it becomes much less a story about just a rural post office. It becomes a story of people who lived. And so, we have a will record, for example, that we were able to get from the State Historical Society. It's also listed on Ancestry.com. If any are related to the Bowmans, you can access it that way. But we start learning that these people had lives. They had property. They had things that were important to them. And we can understand the people that populated these towns. It becomes a lot less about the map. It becomes more about the people who lived there. Now, Gear itself, pretty unremarkable as a community. This is from the Iowa Gazetteer and Business Directory. Two fantastic resources, especially for genealogists. Anybody into genealogy around here? Genealogy was my gateway drug. I started getting into genealogy back in 3rd, 4th grade, and I never got out of it. So, Aunt Jeanette, if you're listening on this, it's your fault. She probably is. She's on Facebook. She's in her 80s, but yeah. Gear, as you can see here, there really is not a whole lot of businesses that are listed there. It was just really existed for the purpose of having that post office there. And again, these post offices were very important to have because you had to have places where people could go get their mail in a relatively short amount of time. Mail sometimes didn't come daily. Sometimes it came 2-3 times a week. And so the postmaster job really was making sure that people got their items in a timely manner. And as you start moving into more of an era of having goods delivered by mail, that became even more important. And again, we're going to talk about that more at the library tonight. So David Mott's book on ghost towns, it has a lot of places listed for Madison County. So if we dig in there and look at a few others, well, we can learn a few more things. So Mott also tells us about Amazon. Where was Amazon? Well, Amazon was a post office for the community of Richmond. Richmond only lasted for 1 year. It was planned in 1850, and by 1851 it had already started to fizzle out. It was laid out in Section 12 of Scott Township, so it was going to Scott Township here, so Section 12 over there on the end. And
I'm not sure how familiar everyone is with the township.
well, that would have been helpful, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Winterset on
Yeah,
there.
Winterset is right here at the edge. I apologize for that there.
And Monroe is where Barney was.
Yeah. So Winterset, this is the city limits. Actually, this is probably right here, not very far from where we're actually standing. I'm pretty sure it's right out here, actually. So Richmond would have been about 6 miles to the southwest of here, or southeast of here, excuse me. Looking at the map backwards, I've turned around here. This happened a lot in the era of speculation. So people would come into the states, they would come into the newly established counties, and they would buy lots and lots of land, and they would lay out these towns in hopes that people would move there. And sometimes they would, and then sometimes these towns would completely fizzle out. Richmond was one of them that completely fizzled out. Other than being on paper, it really didn't exist. So there were a few lots that were sold. I don't know that there were ever any houses built there. The books don't say so, unfortunately. There may have been a few scattered farmhouses, there probably were. But in terms of being an actual town there, we're not going to find any businesses or anything like that. There was a post office, and there was the plans to make something bigger. It just never materialized. It was 1850, so pre-Civil War. And then there's the town of La Vega. Now, I know you're looking at this going, that's the Macksburg post office. Yes, I'm aware of that. La Vega might have been Macksburg's suburb. Well, actually, it probably wouldn't have been. It would have been Macksburg if it had lasted. Macksburg probably wouldn't be here. So La Vega was surveyed by a gentleman whose name was William Davis. William Davis was an early settler who was very involved in the town of Winterset, and he worked with the commissioner here at Madison County, whose name was William Keeney. And they laid out the town of La Vega. Much like Richmond, it never got beyond the paper plans. But it would have been on the northwest corner of where Macksburg is today. And they had it all laid out. It was very well organized. They had it measured down to a 46-rod square. I don't even know what a rod actually is. But they had it all planned out, so it was going to be well surveyed, it was going to be well landscaped, it was going to be well laid out, and then the plans completely fell apart there. They didn't even get their post office at La Vega. At least Richmond had Amazon post office for a short period of time. La Vega was planned, but it never materialized. And so there are a lot of places that are like that. Grandview is another one. 1856, William Heaton came from Greene County, Pennsylvania, and became a permanent resident of Madison County. He bought large tracts of prairie land in Lee Township and wanted to build a town and seminary. He's going to build a seminary here in the county. Had planned for 3 churches and a school. Laid out the town. It was surveyed in October 1857. The stakes were driven into the ground, and the enterprise was abandoned. So he lived in the township till 1885 when he returned back to Illinois. In some cases, we still have what the actual plats even looked like. We can still see what these towns would have looked like had they grown up. So John Gilbertson, was a farmer and preacher. He lived here in the county, and he had the surveyor lay out the town of Brooklyn. Brooklyn, as you can see here, very well organized town as well. Streets, blocks, all well planned. It was going to be a stagecoach stop. And from 1856 to 1860, there was actually some activity. It moved slightly beyond just being on paper. But the problem is that the post office was closed in June of 1860. When the post office closed down, people didn't have any reason to come there. So there were people that still lived there, but by the end of the 1860s, early 1870s, the town of Brooklyn was almost completely forgotten. And when we look at the rural post offices especially, there are so many of them that came and went in such a short period of time that many people would not even consider them. Here's a list of just a few of them that were here in the county. But here's the thing. For those of you who are into genealogy like me, these places are important. And I was doing a program one time up in Pocahontas County. Anybody know where Pocahontas County is? Anybody been there?
Over here in the northwest.
Yeah, northwest. They got a great big Pocahontas standing on the edge of town. And I was doing a program there, and I was doing a similar one to this, and I had the post office list. And there was one up here in Pocahontas County called Shirley. And at the end of the program, a lady comes up to me, and she's got a photograph of a trunk from the 1880s. And she goes, this is a trunk that my ancestors had sent over from Norway. A lot of Norwegians in Pocahontas County. And she goes, I want to show you something. And she shows me a close-up of the front of the trunk, and it says, shipped to Shirley, Iowa on it. It was nothing more than a post office, but it was their new home when they came to the United States. And so we remember these places, not because, again, they're just a name on a map, but because people lived there. They identified with them, and it may very well be that some of the people that are in your family tree identified with them. And it makes it a lot more fun. Okay, so aside from pre-made lists like what David Mott had, how do we go about finding ghost towns? Well, we've already kind of established this. There's a lot of good information that can come from maps. Maps are a lot of fun. I love looking at maps. It drives my wife crazy because I can sit there and look at a map for hours. She's like, what are you doing? Nah, well. So again, you have to be really careful with maps made before 1870 because they're not always accurate. Okay. So 1845, not a whole lot going on in this part of the state, right? So we've got our eastern counties, and then we've got a lot of area that's kind of undeveloped. This up here, this is a neutral strip. Kind of an interesting side note here. This was designed to try to keep the Ho-Chunk and the Lakota from fighting with each other. So they had a strip of land up there where they were trying to keep that at bay. 1850, if we zoom in here, not a whole lot going on in Madison County. The Winterset laid out there. Again, there were small towns coming and going throughout this time. The maps aren't going to capture that just because they were so highly transient. 1855, we got a little bit more going on here. I do want to point out 1855, I talked about map inaccuracies. Notice that Montpelier Post Office is located in Warren County. Not correct. By 1855, though, we start seeing some things happening. So in addition to that here, and it's a little bit hard to see, St. Charles laid out, though. So some places that we recognize. Now, St. Charles had a rival in its early days. Does anybody know this? So St. Charles had a rival. St. Charles laid out in 1852. 2 years before, there was a town called Fairview. And Fairview was laid out on the southwest corner, really now down by where Imesbridge Road is and Warren Avenue. So right on the county line is where Fairview was laid out. And had Fairview survived, St. Charles probably wouldn't have. That's really the defining line there, was whichever one was going to get built up first. Now, Fairview itself might be the most common name that we have in Iowa outside of Washington and Franklin. There were at least 3 other Fairviews, and that's not counting all the Fairview townships and things like that. Fairview is a very common name that was used. They could have really benefited from having a database. You were talking about database earlier. They needed that back then. So it was laid out by a gentleman named Samuel Comstock, and he came to Madison County with the business of being a speculator. He'd bought up a lot of land. He was hoping to lay it out and sell off lots for it. And so the problem that Comstock experienced in 1850 is that Iowa was in the middle of a big cash pinch, because in the late 1840s, there was a shortage of cash on the frontier, and that led to a lot of problems. So by the 1850s, things were getting kind of unstable in Iowa. By the late 1850s, there was an all-out panic, and there were some really big economic problems over on the Mississippi River. It was a little bit more sheltered over here, just because you didn't have that much economic development yet. And so he was trying to get things started here with Fairview. The problem with Mr. Comstock is he did one of the things that so many Americans do, is he bought way more on credit than he should have. Well, when you buy on credit as a shopkeeper, as a businessman, you hope that people come by with cash, because cash is what you need to pay your creditors. The problem with Mr. Comstock is everybody in the area was dealing in eggs and crops and honey, and you can only do so much stuff with your creditors when all you have is eggs and honey and crops. And so, unfortunately, his creditors were not very sympathetic to him. And so not only did he end up having to shelve his whole plan for Fairview and move into St. Charles once it was laid out, but his creditors came from Oskaloosa, and they drug his entire merchandise from his store all the way back to Mahaska County. And so Fairview, while it looked very promising, St. Charles was laid out 2 years later. Fairview was so heavily in debt that he had to end up selling most of his land to pay for his debt, and then he ended up having to eat crow moving to St. Charles anyway. So North Branch is another community that's listed on here. And we also, and I'm always screw this up. So before I get to the library tonight, let's fix this here. Is it Piru or Peru? Piru. Piru, okay. Okay. I know it's not Peru. We know that much, but Piru, yeah, okay.
It's actually East Peru.
Well, this isn't East, this is not East Piru. This is Old Piru. East Piru wasn't here yet. So we got North Branch and Piru on here, which now we would call Old Piru. This is the Henry Williams map from 1855. And so these are two, again, very early communities. If you look here, this is going to be the stagecoach line. So the stagecoach line is going through North Branch. That makes sense because that's where the Quakers were, right? Over here in Piru, there's not much of anything going on. How did this one even get off the ground? Luck more than anything else. And that plays a big role in what towns survive and what towns don't. Now, this is the J.H. Colton map from the same year. So this is 1855, North Branch, Piru, Winterset. There's a lot more going on in this map, right? Again, you can't rely on them. They're inconsistent. This one has a lot more detail and a lot more communities that are on here. So we're going to take a look for the next few minutes at both of these here and just kind of dig in a little bit. So I'm going to make some observations. Now, one of the big things when you're hunting for ghost towns is knowing where to find them. And with post offices, it's really tricky because sometimes they move around depending on who the postmaster is. With the actual established towns, it gets a little bit easier. So if you haven't noticed yet, most of our counties are square. That's by intent. It actually makes things really easy to work with. Over in the eastern part of the United States, not so much. They used a lot of rocks and trees and waterways to create survey lines. Well, that's not a real good way to do surveys because rocks move and waterways move and trees fall down, and it makes it really hard to be consistent on where your property lines are. So when they started laying out the western states, they went with a grid system, which makes it a lot easier to find things. And again, those of you who had Earlham last year, you might remember this here, so don't give away the answer. So this is the public land survey system. This is what most of Iowa was laid out with. And so it makes it really easy if we can find out a land description to figure out where our ghost towns are. And we can use the measurements to pinpoint exactly where they would have been. Now, this one isn't a ghost town, but here's a description. And I know you said that people aren't real familiar with townships, so I'll just make this more challenging, and that's okay. So where am I here? If I'm on the north half of the southwest quarter of Section 29, Township 76, Range 26 West. Not even a guess?
Here.
Here? That would be fun. No, actually, I'd be standing in Patterson. But it makes it really easy to figure out where these places were, as long as we have notation of where they were laid out. And in some cases, we have really good examples of that. So if we look at Madison County, again, 1855, we have our common roads laid out here. We have our proposed railroads on here. And then we have just a smattering of other places on here. So I'm going to start here with this one over here, Bibbs Point. Kind of a funny name on there. Bibbs Point we don't know much about, other than we know that it was in Section 3 of, and I've dropped the name of the township on that one there. Is that Walnut? South, yeah. So Section 3 is South Township.
It's on the south and north side.
And so we can pinpoint exactly where Bibbs Post Office would have been. Now, it's irrelevant for us because, again, this was one that only lasted for a year. It was a very short-lived experiment. And there's no real record of it, not even in the U.S. Postal Service registry. We don't know where it would have been, except for the fact that we know that it was also later known as Bell's Point or Bell's Ridge. And so when we go in there and we look at the survey system, we can pick out exactly where that would have been. So here's Bevington Park Road, here's 228th Lane, and the post office would have been right up there in that corner. Again, why do we care? Well, if your family was one of the early settlers here, they probably at least went by here. They may have gotten their mail here, and they would have known people that lived in the area. So if we look at the other ones that are on here, let's start out here with Old Peru. It was described in 1879 by the Union Historical Company as a little village of about 100 inhabitants. It was located in Walnut Township, about 9 miles southeast of Winterset on Section 3. So we're getting where the location was. Northeast quarter of the southeast quarter. Yeah, I know there's a lot of northeast of the southeast. That's okay. It was laid out by Aaron Hyatt, September 1855, and is one of the older towns in the county. There is a good flouring mill here called the Centennial Mill, built in 1875 by Jesse Hyatt. It cost $11,500. What an investment. It has a 3-run of stone with all the latest improvements, including the patent process, and it's 3-story frame building. So Peru would have been a big landmark. There was a big mill there. People would have known about it. And people would have come to that community, and they would have expected businesses to be there. And indeed there were. This is an advertisement here, again, from the business directory of Madison County. Town also had other things. So there were 2 stores. There were 2 blacksmith shops. There were 2 hotels in Peru. There was, of course, the postmaster. There was a justice of the peace there, and also 3 physicians. Now, I heard somebody talk about East Peru. We're going to get to that here in a second, and we'll talk more about that tonight at the program at the library, because the railroad came by and it bypassed Peru, and that's when East Peru was laid out. So Peru became Old Peru unofficially, but in 1887, East Peru was laid out. That was the railroad town, and that's where people eventually gravitated towards. And before long, the businesses that were there in the old community had all moved to the new one, rendering the old one all but a ghost town. Now, North Branch is a name that we're not real familiar with, maybe so much, but we know what the outcome of it was. I don't know that we can call North Branch really a ghost town because it evolved more than anything else. And when the railroad came through, the Quakers that were at North Branch laid out the town of Earlham. So Earlham and North Branch really are in many ways the same community. If we turn our attention back to that 1855 map, there's some other stuff going on here. There's other markings on here, other places. Now, I'm going to use this here. This is probably a little hard for you to read in the back here. But this is a directory that was published in the Frontier Guardian, which was a newspaper in Canesville. Canesville, the Mormon settlement that became Council Bluffs. And if you look here, there's a number of places that are listed that are on this 1855 map. So from Fort Des Moines, we come into Brown's Ford on the North River. That's here in Madison County. A place called Sturman's, a location called Happy Grove, followed by Claim Jumpers Grove. And then after that, then we pass into Cass County. And first location in Cass County is one of my favorite named places, Watauga, also known as Loucks Grove. If you've seen pictures of that old abandoned church in Cass County, that's roughly where that was. So these were all places that people would have came to if they were traveling by wagon from Des Moines to Council Bluffs. And this was actually reprinted in a number of places. Even the miners up in Dubuque had a copy of this. Now, most of these places that are in here, not really a town at all, but they were small, very small settlements. And so if we look at them individually, we see that some of them do have some history in there. Again, these are all going to show up on both those things here. So Camp Luce, no post office. It was located on Badger Creek. The map is incorrect. It shows it on North River. But we know from people who kept records and kept diaries that it was on Badger Creek. It would have been about 2 miles west of town on the Cumming Road. Other than that, we don't know a whole lot about it, though. It was only there for a short period of time. It was not official in any capacity. It was just a place that people knew by name. Kind of like when we tell people, well, you know, I live down at Red Rock or I live over at Dale Maffett. Well, you don't actually live at the lake or the reservoir, right? It's just somewhere in that area. Same idea. Now, this one's kind of a fun one. Claim Jumpers Grove. Who knows what a claim jumper is?
Somebody who jumps somebody else's claim.
That's exactly what it was there. So somebody illegally seizes or claims land that already legally belongs to somebody else, often for mineral rights. That was kind of the big thing in Iowa. So depending on where you were in Iowa, it might be lead, it might be coal, it might be honey. It could be any number of things. Claim Jumpers Grove shows up on a lot of early maps. It did not have a post office, but it was a stagecoach stop. Stagecoach stops were very important because if you think about it, they were very, very uncomfortable. They were not like we see in the movies. Those wheels had no shocks on them, which meant you were bouncing along on no roads, essentially, at the time, and it got very uncomfortable. So you needed a place every few miles, really, to get up and stretch. Not only that, you had to trade out horses because they wore out really easily on the prairie. So these different groves, they were established more or less because they had timber. So Happy Grove, Claim Jumpers Grove, they had places where people could get logs to build cabins and build shacks, things like that, build fences. And so in addition to that, they also provided fuel during the winter months. And so these groves became places where people were very familiar because they knew that there would be some element of resources there. So when you see groves on the map, those are places where people would typically try to stay. Sturman shows up on both lists. It's one of the few places that I've looked into that I can't literally find anything about. Nobody seems to know what it was or where it was. And again, more than anything, these are just little landmarks. Brown's Ford, it was a crossing on the North River. Sturman's, again, was referenced as late as the 1880s in the Winterset News. Still very hard to pin down where it was, though. Happy Grove shows up occasionally in the newspaper. I just love the name of it on there. Let's see here. I don't want to spend too much time reading next. We're getting a little bit short on time. I've got other things to show you. But these places did have a population. Even if it was unofficial, it was people who identified with them. Okay, so 1870s, we're at our improved maps. So let's take a look at some of these places. 1870s, so we know a little bit more about them. We can see easily where they were. So Buffalo. Buffalo was located south of Winterset on the Middle River. It was laid out in 1850 and began as a milling community. 1850, there was a corn cracker mill there that began an operation. A corn cracker was a little mill. It was only slightly above a portable building at that point. So it was a very small operation. And what they did was they crushed corn into very coarse cornmeal. So they didn't have to be real particular about it. A lot of what they produced at these corn cracker mills were used for animal feed. So they would use the corn, they would grind it down to sizable chunks, and then they would feed it to their animals. Now in 1851, a sawmill was built on the river, and that changed the course of things in this area. Again, when you have a sawmill there, you have people that can get lumber, they can get resources to build their homes. They're more likely to stay in the area. It's more likely to become permanent. And in 1851, that little corn cracker mill was sold to a gentleman named William Compton. Compton was a little bit more enterprising, and he built a bigger mill on the site. And there was a grist mill that eventually became located right there on the Middle River. And so they called the town Compton in his honor, but they also called it Buffalo Mills. And the name Buffalo Mills came from Compton's heavy buffalo hide coat that he wore during the winter months. Made him a very memorable figure among the people in the neighborhood. In 1874, he sold the mill. The mill lasted through its next ownership until 1880 when it was destroyed in a flood. Even though they were reinforced, the floods were highly detrimental to our mills, as you can imagine, because they lacked the technology to make things that would withstand those high-pressure water. Until we get to the 1880s, when they start using brick for mills, they still were highly temporary if you got bad conditions. So 1886, the mill washes out and takes the dam along with it. Really brings about the end of the industrial part of the community. Buffalo never had a post office, so it didn't have any of that resource there, but it did have a pretty good population. One estimate that I saw shows about 50 families and up to 100 children based on the size of the local school there at Buffalo, which was one of the largest in the area outside of Winterset. So it would have been a place that people were very familiar with. And it's interesting that it doesn't show up at all in any of the Iowa Gazetteers, because even our small milling communities are in there. And the only thing that I can think about why it wouldn't have been in there is because there were maybe so many other Buffaloes and Buffalo Groves and things like that maybe they got confused with it. There's many other Buffalo communities. Kaysen was another rural post office, in many ways similar to Gear. It opened in 1861 and lasted until 1905, again when rural free delivery came about. And it was named for Iowa Representative John Kaysen, who was an assistant postmaster general in Washington, D.C. during the Lincoln administration. He later was ambassador to Germany and Austria. Kaysen has a little bit more going on there. We see it had a general store. Interesting here, in the Gazetteer, it has a woman business owner listed in there. That happened, but it was still more unusual. So we got Elizabeth Newton, the dressmaker. We also have a hardware and blacksmith shop in there. The town itself had a population of 15, so about the size of Beaconsfield or Leroy, I suppose. But it did also have a Methodist church there. And so there was an element of the community there, and whoever it was that put the nice sign up for Gear also put up a very similar sign for Kaysen. So if you know who did that, please thank them. The 1901 atlases often go into even more detail because by that point in time, the map makers were being more specific and their customers were demanding better maps. People were traveling a lot more. People were going out and they were seeing what was in the area. There was an element of exploration that was being encouraged, and a lot of that was due to the railroad. And so by the time we get to 1901, we look in the Madison County Atlas, we can see full plats of what the communities looked like. And so we can see, for example, what a place like Webster would have been, what it would have looked like. Webster is also known as Middle River because Webster couldn't be used as the post office. There was already a Webster over in Keokuk County at that point in time. So the town itself was called Webster, but the post office was Middle River. So it actually had two names, which made things a little bit interesting sometimes. It was not just a town, though, like Kaysen that clustered around a post office. It was planned. It was intentional. It was designed to be a place where people lived. Now, today the town would have just been beyond the bridge there. There's a few homes there today, but not a whole lot beyond that. It was originally laid out in 1855 by a gentleman named Otha Davis. He was a shopkeeper, and he was one of two merchants in town. There was also a blacksmith. Blacksmiths were very hard to find in the 1850s out here. Closest blacksmiths were often up in the Des Moines area, or again, over towards Oskaloosa. So having a blacksmith here, a repairman, very, very important. There was a sawmill and a grinding mill that was built here eventually as well. And the town even had a very active Masonic lodge in the 1870s and 1880s with more than 30 members at its peak, which would have been most of the men in town. Again, if we look at the business directory, we see that there were businesses in town. There was a grocery store. There was a physician. There was a justice of the peace there as well. These were all essential jobs at the time. And even into the early part of the 20th century, we can still see stories about the people that lived there. And once we explore the people that lived in these communities, we begin learning more about them. Now, this particular newspaper here is about a resident that lived in a community of Ord. Has anybody heard of Ord? Okay, good. Sometimes we get really lucky with newspapers, and they tell us a lot about a community. So Ord, similar in many ways to Middle River. Blacksmith, livestock, general store, physician, and miller. The town itself existed as a midway point. So Ord, unlike Middle River, was unplatted. It was not laid out into streets. It was not planned. But there was a church there. There was a post office there from 1888 until 1905. Again, rural free delivery impacted that. And as we move into the 20th century, as you might expect, we start seeing technological changes impacting these communities. And so the railroad took care of many of the small ones. If they weren't on a railroad, they had a much less likely shot of being successful. Now, there were always exceptions. Macksburg, for example, they did briefly have a railroad there, and we'll discuss that again tonight, but not a railroad community like Truro was in any real sense of the word. Ord itself didn't have any railroad nearby, and so people moved away from these communities towards places where they had reliable transportation. Now, the church is still there in the area, but it's privately owned, and last time I was by there, it didn't look particularly well maintained. Maybe things have changed. Obviously, stuff happens, and so we don't want to fault people for that, but it just shows how these places evolved. They go from a population center down to just a single owner that takes over that site. Penn Center, one of the ghost towns that we might talk about, what we might see today. Penn Center also not laid out with town streets. Penn Center was a crossroad. It was literally at the crossroad of the townships. But these crossroads were where many of the early roads were laid out. And even when gravel roads came out, these were some of the first ones that were paved. And so even if they didn't have trains coming through there, they were still places that people could get to easily. So in 1868, settlers could buy land in the area for about $6.50 per acre. It was a bargain. Within a year and a half, by 1870, the prices had risen from about $10 to $15. So they more than doubled in some cases. So the people that owned land, they had the potential to make some good money. In 1868, there were only 7 improved farms on the Penn Center Road. But by 1870, there were enough people there that they had 5 schools in the vicinity within a couple of miles of there. The Penn Center community was known for its social aspect. There were picnics that took place there. There were people that went to the church and then they socialized afterwards. As technology improved in the late part of the 19th century, early 20th century, you find that farmers suddenly become a lot more social. And so these crossroad communities provide a social outlet for that. They would have ice cream socials. They would have events that corresponded with the church or with the school there. They would have programs put on by the students. They would put on entertainment. And it was something that brought people together in that neighborhood. The Methodist Church was that central landmark for the community. Hanley, we're going to talk about more this evening, again over at the library. It was a railroad community. And it was laid out on a rail line just to the west of St. Charles. Matter of fact, it was for a period of time known as West St. Charles. But the problem with Hanley was it was on a completely different rail line from St. Charles. And so they had the rail line went different places. And so these communities sometimes could exist right next to each other, and they could still manage to thrive because they had 2 different things that they were supplying. They were taking people 2 different places. But there's no railroad that goes through there now. And so there's no passenger trains going through there. And so as passenger service dried up in the 20th century, as that technology changed, the need for a community like Hanley disappeared. Pitzer, well, it was named, you were waiting for that one there. I should have put that one at the beginning for you. Well, Pitzer in some ways is kind of like Barney. Is it truly a ghost town? There's still people who live in the area there. It was named for John Pitzer. He was a merchant here in Winterset. He was also one of the early postmasters here in town. Again, somebody who, if you read the story about him, was very well known to the people of this community. And the post office at Pitzer, even though it was established, named for a postmaster, he was never postmaster there. Postmaster actually was a lady named Mary Spear, which is interesting because postmistress jobs were one of the first federal appointments that women could have. And it was out of necessity in many cases. If you had a woman that could run the post office, you took advantage of her being able to do that because you may not have anybody else in the area that could handle something like that. And so that became an important thing for women in the 19th century and early 20th century, that they could have a federal job. Because postmasters were appointed by the feds. It was a federal position. Now, Pitzer itself was a small hamlet, much like the crossroad at Penn Center. But it, too, had a number of businesses over the years. It had a blacksmith shop. It had a meat locker at one time. And people would bring their livestock there. It had a store. And as things improved and as technology changed, it even had its own telephone office. Most of the businesses have closed or moved from there, though. And that's what we find happens as we start moving into the period of time with the Great Depression. The Great Depression started really changing the communities in Iowa. Things were already changing by that point in time. Now, a lot of people think about the 1920s as being the Roaring 20s, right? But the 1920s really were not a very good period of time in Iowa. And the reason for that is because during World War I, people went heavily into mortgaging their farms because crop prices were really, really high during World War I. They were supplying food for the troops, and they were supplying food for countries overseas. Really the first time we have a big overseas international market. But when World War I ended, the price fell out on the crops. All those farmers that had mortgaged their property found themselves in a real bind. And so between 1920 and 1929, Iowa actually saw a huge wave of bank closures, and they saw a huge wave of farm foreclosures. People don't realize that. Iowa was in a bad position going into the Great Depression. And you compound World War II on top of that, and you start having a lot of communities that really are struggling. And Worthington was one of those communities as well. It was laid out in 1868, and there was a church that was built there in 1881. There was a plat. Plat was laid out in 1858, and it was designed to be an actual community, much like St. Charles and Truro. There was a store there, but the store never really got off the ground because the guy who owned it died suddenly. There was a post office that was there, but really the church was the lifeblood of that community. And so when we move into the 20th century, in the middle 20th century, we find that that's often the case. The churches and the schools are really what keeps these communities around. But once they start closing down, these places start disappearing. Worthington's still there, but it's not much of a town, right? It's not much of a population center. There's a cemetery there, though, and people still associate with that. When they go out to the cemetery, they see people that they know and that they love that are buried there. And so when we think about the churches and what they were, and we think about what the schools were, and we think about what these crossroad communities were, they all do share one thing in common. We can argue about whether they were a town or whether they were not a town, or whether they were a settlement or a community or a hamlet, and throw around vocabulary words. But at the end of the day, they were a place that was important to people. And they were important for a variety of reasons. They may have been important spiritually, they may have been important from an educational standpoint, it may have just been a place that their family associated with. But all these communities have an importance to somebody, or they had an importance to somebody. And so when I go and I look at these ghost towns and I read about them, I figure out what it was about them that makes their story interesting. There's a few things that I've come over the years to find that they all have in common, and that we have in common as people who live in Iowa, and as Americans, and as people on planet Earth. So why do we care about ghost towns? What makes this important? Well, obviously you're all here on a Tuesday morning for some reason, and I'm assuming it's not because of my good looks. Well, why would we do that? Well, there's probably a few answers for that, but really one of the things that I've found in talking to people is that some level, we're all fascinated by what was once here that is no longer here. And when we go into a place like Pitzer and we think about what would have been there at one point in time, or we go into a place like Middle River and we look and we go, wow, there was once a place here and there's nothing left of it. What happened to it and why? What happened to the people that lived there? And it makes us pause and it makes us think, well, could that happen to the places that are important to us? It can, and it does. So we're fascinated by that and maybe a little bit troubled by it. There's a little bit of a disconcerting feeling walking into a site and knowing that there was something big that was once there and there's nothing but a field left. And I think as humans, we have that natural curiosity. It's kind of a morbid curiosity, but it's a curiosity nonetheless. Of course, we care about ghost towns. We've talked about this for historical and genealogical research. If you're a genealogist, you have to know where these places were. My great-great-grandmother, born in a ghost town here in Iowa, not in Madison County, over in Marion County. For years, we couldn't figure out where she was actually born because nobody knew where it was. Well, some nice person finally put up a sign. It's like, she was born just west of Knoxville. A little place called Donley Station. Hasn't been there in over 100 years. We look at these places because we want to understand why some communities thrive and why others do not. Why is St. Charles still around and Barney's barely around? What's the difference between the two? They're both railroad towns, right? Well, they were railroad towns at different periods of time. They were railroad towns that did different things. They had different locations. When the highways came through, St. Charles was in a much better position along the interstate than Barney. It's going to impact how things change and how things evolve. Again, we want to keep our own communities from meeting a similar fate. I am involved in probably way more organizations than I should. My wife would definitely say that. But the thing about it is, it's hard to find people my age that are willing to sit on boards and be part of these things. And it's important that we get that carried on to the next generation. And at this point here, I've been out of college almost pushing 20 years, and I'm going, you know what, there's a whole generation coming behind me now. Let's get them involved here. And we want to make sure that our communities don't meet that similar fate. And the way do we do that is we get people involved. And we get people to share their time and their talent, and we get them to volunteer. We get them to socialize. We get them to talk to each other. The more people talk to each other, the more likely they are to build relationships. And that ultimately is what the goal of a community is, right? Whether that's a church, whether that's a school, whether that's a city. It doesn't matter. They're all the same. We want to understand the social and economic impacts. We look at these places and we see what happened to them. And again, we want to understand how people lived there, and we want to be able to extrapolate the best part of that and maybe improve on things that didn't work out so well. And on that same note, communities, both extant and non-extant, they bring us together. The places that are important to us, we want to talk about. We want to think about the memories of. And when you talk about the places that were home or were special to you, other people, even if they're from 1,000 miles away, are going to have stories that they're going to be willing to share as well. And so it helps build a connection between people. And that's ultimately what I enjoy out of this here. So the 29th state, it is an opportunity for people to connect with each other. I will admit I am a terrible web programmer, which is why it is housed on Facebook, because I can't design a web page to save my life. I'm getting better, though. It's also great because it's a big pool of people. People can come together and they can share stories. And one of the great things that I enjoy about this page is people coming together and telling about these communities, and they swap stories. And it's so much fun if somebody over here might be in a completely different state and they say, hey, my grandma and grandpa lived at Hanley, and somebody else here in Winterset says, hey, mine did too, and next thing you know, they're talking to each other and their grandparents were neighbors. Or in the case of one program I did, I discovered that two people sitting in the front row next to each other, the lady's sister had dated the guy that was sitting there, and whoo, did she have some stories. It was interesting. Those sorts of fun things happen. And so even if you're not on Facebook, you can still get to the 29th state. I've got it open. All you have to do is go to Google and type in the 29th state. Even if you're not on Facebook, you can read it. If you're not on Facebook, you can't comment, but you can still read the comments. And it's a great way to learn about Iowa history. So in addition to that, I hope that what people take away from it is not just an appreciation for the past, but how we can use the past, use the past to make a better future. So again, my name is Dave Baker. I run the 29th state. It is available on Facebook. At the 29th state, I do have a website, iowathe29thstate.com. It is getting better all the time. You can also reach me at the 29th state at Gmail, and I love answering questions. I will say, give me a little bit of time. I'm not always the fastest person responding to emails. It's a bad habit of mine. Now, if you're so inclined, no obligation, you will not hurt my feelings. I do have a new book on the market as of last year, and I'm very excited about this. No ghost towns in this one, actually, though. This is the history, one page for each community, of all the incorporated towns in the center 33 counties of Iowa. That does include Madison County. So you can learn not only about your favorite places here in the area, but you can also figure out what makes things tick over in Oskaloosa, or what is the big deal up in Pleasant Hill, or you can learn about the Dutch over in Pella, so you can go tulip time next year, all those good things. So I should preface, if you're from Cass County, it does not have Cass County in here. That was the cutoff line. Iowa obviously has 99 counties. The center 33 is really nice because it's an even third. I can do an eastern third, a western third, and a central third. But you got to draw the line somewhere. So western third is in production right now. I don't know when it's going to be done, hopefully soon. The sooner I get it done, the happier my wife will be, I'll tell you that much. If you are interested in a copy of it, again, no obligation. They are $60. If you do cash or check, they're $60. If you do credit, I can do that, but because credit card fees stink, they are a little bit more with that. But 400 some pages, full color, and lots of fun stuff in there. So lastly, before I wrap up here, I always have to put this out there. I would be nothing without our fantastic sources. Iowa, I don't know a lot about how other states do it, but Iowa, we have a fantastic historical library downtown. Contrary to what people say, we have a fantastic historical research center in Iowa City as well, and it is going to be reopened. I feel it. People at the Capitol, I hope you're watching that. I know you've adjourned, but I still know you creep on my page once in a while. We have wonderful resources in Iowa, and we have great libraries that digitize newspapers. We have great historical societies and historical complexes that make materials available both online and in person, and I would not be able to do anything that I do without them. So if you're a member here, if you are involved with the library, thank you, thank you, thank you. I greatly appreciate all that you do. It is important to me, and you probably don't hear that thanks enough. So, and in addition to that, the people that worked on the Madison County history book, that's just a lot of fun to look through. I've enjoyed reading that. I can't say I've done it cover to cover, but picking up pieces here and there. I've gone through it probably 3 times now looking for different things, and it's just a lot of fun. So,
Which one, the 1915 or the 84?
the 84. Well, I've looked at both of them, but the 84 one is a lot of fun because you get a lot of contemporary stuff in there. So, thank you very much, everybody. I greatly appreciate it. Thank you for coming today.
I'm sure Dave will entertain some questions, but you've been seated a long time, so I want to give you the
Yeah, get up. I'll stick around here. Get up and move a little bit. Yeah.
6 o'clock tonight at the Winterset Library, Dave will be talking about railroads in Madison County, if that's an interest of yours.
What time?
6 p.m. Thank you. Thank you. Did you like it? Okay, good, good, good.
I can't wait to see it online, and I may ask you for a couple pictures. And
Please do.
We've got things to talk about.
Okay.
I've got some more. I don't know that you'll ever do this again, but this is the time if I've got a couple more photos. to
Oh,
send
absolutely, absolutely. And I hope to do it again. This was a good one to work on. I will say, actually, the railroad one was more challenging than what I expected. I've done railroads for several counties. Madison County had a lot of good railroad access, but there's not a whole lot of good, railroad stories, so to speak, that I found. I was kind of surprised.
Our librarian, our director of the library, you've been talking with Chris,
Yeah,
as an
yeah.
employee, but Dave Hargrove started, he's a historian. He's got his master's in history.
Oh, fantastic.
And he wanted a topic and wanted to do the poor farm. I said, I did the poor farm. Why don't you do the railroads? Because it just seemed like a spider's web. And he did some things in the newspaper, and he found it difficult.
Yeah, there's definitely stuff in there to make a good program. Otherwise, I would have written weeks ago and gone, we need to change this. But I've done railroads in Mahaska County, and there's entire books on that one. I thought, Madison County is going to be like that, and it wasn't. How are you?
Hi, thank you. That was very fun. I
Thank
really
you.
enjoyed it.
I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Okay. We have somewhat of a connection to Queens Point. Can you direct me as to where I can find out anything more about the Queens Point? You mentioned that.
Okay, let's see here.
It was just in
It was
one
on
of
the post
lists.
office ones, wasn't
Yeah,
it?
I think it was.
Let's see here. Where was that at here?
Quite a ways back, I think. Sort of middle-ish.
There we go. It was here in the post offices.
Yep.
So, South Township.
Yep,
Not a whole lot of information on it, but let me see what I can dig up, maybe. Because you have to draw the line somewhere, and so these I didn't go into as much depth, but I might be able to dig up some stuff. Let me. You have a phone number or an email address?
Oh, gosh, well, we don't make it downtown Des Moines. We've always talked about spending more time there, but we're busy still working basically
I get it.
day by day. And I have a phone number. But,
Okay. Let me grab a piece of paper here real quick. No, this is the kind of stuff I enjoy. Let's see here.
I do have one of those.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, we can use this. And what was your name?
And Karen. We're not long timers in Madison County, but we live supposedly, somebody has said, on a stage line.
Okay.
Now, whether that, is just hearsay, but there is no connection. Look at the landscape and go, how in the world could that be?
Oh, you'd be surprised. Let me see what I can find. I have a lot of fun looking at stuff like this. I had a lady a couple weeks ago that we go to church with, and she goes, I wonder if you could help me with something. I said, yeah, what is it? She goes, I'm looking for trying to figure out if my great-great-great-grandfather ran a store. I said, okay, where was it? It was Clinton. I said, well, Clinton's a big city. I'll see what I can find. I was able to not only find that her grandfather had a store, but I found an address for it, and we were able to figure out exactly where it was. Well, I don't know if you're familiar at all with Clinton. Probably not. But that's
Not really.
okay.
No,
So the north part of Clinton was actually a separate town called Lyons.
okay.
When Clinton got big, they merged the two of them together into one community. Well, her store was in the Lyons part of Clinton, which is why she couldn't find it, because she was looking down here in the old part of it. And so we were able to pinpoint exactly where it was, and we could even find, now the building's not there anymore, but we were able to find the exact intersection where it sat and everything, and she was just thrilled. And it took me all of 15 minutes to find it, so
Really?
yeah.
Oh my.
So
Yeah, well,
I will look when I get home and see what I can find.
The web.
You figure out where to search, and you figure out who to ask. That's half the battle.
That's cool. And yeah, thank you. I want to thank your wife for allowing this.
Well, I will pass that on, because she tolerates it very well, and she's a good sport about it. So
She probably feels a bit left out or a bit.
it's funny, because people say, well, does she ever come to your stuff? And I say, she listens to me talk about this crap all day long. No, she didn't come to my stuff anymore. She used to. But, it's kind of funny, because we've been married 14 years this year, and we've been together 17. And this project predates us getting married. And I remember telling her, yeah, I go out and I look for ghost towns. She's like, okay, you some kind of weirdo, you know? Exactly. And we joke about the book. She's like, you were going to have that done 15 years ago. I said, yeah, but I keep finding more stuff. It's taking me a lot longer. And
Well, I've taken your time.
well,
and I believe you've got
thank you so much, Karen. I will do some digging for you and see what I can find.
You mentioned Buffalo Center, down here south of town.
That's right.
Just east of Buffalo Mill, there was a school there called Buffalo School.
Okay.
And just east of that, across the river, and up on the hill, my great-great-grandparents settled there.
Okay. Now, did your ancestors go to the Buffalo School then?
Yes, my mother went to Buffalo School.
Your mother did.
So did her brothers and sisters.
Because that was the thing about Buffalo, is there were so many kids in that area. And if you think about the time frame on there, that would have been, people think about the baby boom after World War II, but there was a baby boom back in the late 1890s as well, early 20s, because medicine was evolving so quickly. You still had a lot of infant mortality, but you had a lot less of it. And
My
so,
grandfather was born in 1877.
okay, so you'd have been a little bit
Right
before
there
that.
on the river.
Isn't that something? That's amazing.
Their name was Kellogg.
Okay.
We've got a picture of Buffalo School too. I'm going to take you downstairs to our.
Yes, I want to see that for sure. Oh.
You mentioned that thing.
See, that's why I do this, because people connect with that stuff, and it's fun to hear the stories about it. Now,
That's pronounced Casson, not Cason.
oh, is it really? Interesting. Okay.
Dad went to school at Casson School.
I'm glad to hear that, and that's one of the interesting things. So I see your shirt there.
Well, that's just one shirt I threw on.
Well, that's okay. So my mother-in-law is from Nevada, but you know why Nevada's pronounced that way, don't you?
Taken away from Nevada.
Well, it was, but they didn't know how Nevada was pronounced because there was no radio or anything, so they just pronounced it how they did colloquially. So it's interesting to hear them say Casson, because they call the governor up in Des Moines Cason. So,
I always heard it was Casson.
well, it could, who knows? Could be either one. And same thing with Piru. I mean, it's the same way. And
Which is now called Old Town.
yep,
Because East Piru's down the hill.
yeah, exactly. And if you go up in northern Iowa, the one I can't figure out is it's spelled Tripoli, but they say Tripola. I'm like, how do you get Tripola out of that?
I study history.
Did you really?
Yep.
Where at?
Here in Winterset.
Okay.
I'm a good history teacher.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, I started out as a history major, and then I realized that I'd be in the poor farm if I did that. So I switched to business. And it's funny because professionally I work for Iowa State University. I work in their business office. And I was joking with my boss one time. I said, I don't even know how I got this job. And she goes, we needed somebody who could read boring stuff, and you were a history minor, so she goes, you were ahead of the pack there.
Yeah.
I said, that figures. What was your name?